Welcome to our podcast series called Theology 101. If you have been following it along, we are now on our 16th episode, and this one is within the category called Humanity. And I thought initially I would have 3 parts, then it became 4 parts, and now it will be 5 parts, only because to break down the different parts into bite-sized pieces, it became necessary. So just let me review, and if you'd like the written PDF version, it's a lot more organized. This will be a lot more of a free flow conversation, and forgive me for a little bit of a cough that is still there, hasn't totally gone. Humanity, in the first one, we focused on humanity in our created essence as humans to love as we are loved. In part 2, we focused on the reality of how things go wrong in our world and in our lives. And the traditional biblical word for this is sin, or, what some people have called the fall. So creation, the fall. In part 3, we began to focus more specifically on the Christian life, the life of redemption. How do we rise up again with God above, beside, and within us, powering us for living love in all its dimensions, despite the challenges and the struggles. We dug into the meaning of grace and the movement of the Holy Spirit, which are essential for the Christian life. We reflected on some important qualities, which there are many, of the Spirit-filled life, some qualities such as gratitude, humility, generosity, the importance of faith and hope to support love, and finally, peace. And you can listen to that. That's number 15, episode 15 last week on that. Now, in this part 4, we will dig into some deeper questions that have been with us from the beginnings of Christianity. For instance, what role do human freedom, free will, and choice play in the Christian life when we're so dependent on grace and the Holy Spirit to empower and transform us? Right? There's free will, then there's grace and the Holy Spirit. Also, how do we think of growth and maturity in the Christian life when we continue to struggle with sin? And by sin, again, I mean anti-love feelings and behaviors. Sin. How do we grow and mature when we still struggle with sin? So let me deal with this question first and then the one after. So during the Protestant Reformation about 500 years ago in Europe, there was a debate all about this free will and grace. So on the one hand, Christians have grace and the Holy Spirit to empower us. On the other hand, there is a freedom in us we are supposed to exercise. And are we supposed to keep progressing so that we are empowered and our freedom is such that sin becomes less and less an issue in our lives? The word for this progress, this progression is called, the traditional word is sanctification. So let me talk about 2 reformers that had a different way into this. They were close and yet they were different. So there's Martin Luther. Luther was a man who knew inner torment and struggle. Today we'd probably say that he would have bouts of depression, of despair. He struggled, Luther, and he knew what struggle was about. And so for him, the experience of the experience of grace and the Holy Spirit was something that not only happened at the beginning, but it's something that he needed like water regularly and like food regularly. He continued to experience moments of torment, of discouragement under the stress of Reformation, of trying to do the right thing, of behaving well with grace himself when he would fall into difficulty and inner whether it was bitterness, resentment, anger, frustration. So he struggled, and yet for him, the experience of justification, which is the traditional word of grace and the Holy Spirit, of experiencing God anew as if for the first time, it was a regular feature of his life because he needed it like food and water. But then you have John Calvin, and even though Calvin was definitely a man of struggle, and he struggled with bitterness, and some would have said he was an angry man, or he always had a scowl, and yet Calvin, he talks in his journals, yes, of deep losses. He had severe health issues, as did Luther, serious, probably it would be, irritable bowel syndrome in an extreme way. And there was very limited antibiotics or medicines at the time. So he, Calvin struggled. He did. And yet, the way he talked about the Christian life was one where progression was something that should happen, that the Christian should have less and less an issue with sin, even though sin will never be eradicated in one's life. Because otherwise, how do you talk about maturity and growth if there isn't a way to measure that, right? So what do you think about this difference? I tend to, because I'm just going to be honest, tend to side more with Luther, even though I don't have some of the challenges he had. And yet, I have my moments. And sometimes I'm not at my best, but even at my worst. I struggle with anti-love feelings sometimes. And, and it takes me, it's always a little bit of a journey to get back to the place where I am feeling the Spirit and the movement of God in me, and that flow of grace and feeling the love just fill me up again so that I can begin to engage the world out of that place. It's a constant experience. Now, do you say there's no growth, Harris? No, I'm not the same person I was. Absolutely. There are certain issues in my life, certain attitudes, certain ways with certain people that thankfully are no longer the struggle they were. I've come to a place, whether it's peace and acceptance, whether it's graciousness, whether it's compassion and care, understanding the situation, opening up my heart. But at the same time, there's always new situations that come up and throw me off my game, so to speak, my spirit game. And I have to find my way again and again. So what about you? How is it for you in terms of the Christian life where grace and freedom, the free will to make good choices? Well, and this leads us to the second point, and that is a debate actually that began much earlier. And that is at the time, probably the 4th century. The great figure here is Augustine, and the other figure is Pelagius. Now, Pelagius was someone who believed in free will, because how do you hold people accountable if they're not free to make choices? And so Pelagius felt that people are responsible, they're accountable. There is no reason in the world why you can't make a positive choice rather than a negative one. And it's that. Grace is there to support you. The Holy Spirit is there to surround you, but ultimately it is your choice, your call. And if you are falling into sin, you have no one ultimately to blame but yourself. Augustine, on the other hand, was someone who had known what it's like to be caught in addiction, in compulsions, in obsessions. He was someone who understood how easy it is to fall into cycles and then to be caught in them, and how difficult it is to extricate yourself even if you have all the free will in the world. And so Augustine really wanted to emphasize the power of grace in one's life, the experience of it, and the power of the Holy Spirit to move you through. And that with the empowerment of the Holy Spirit and with the experience of grace in a fulsome way, this then empowers you to make good choices. So Augustine believed in choice, in free will and freedom, and yet freedom, in order to truly be free, needs the empowerment of the Holy Spirit. And without the empowerment of the Holy Spirit, without grace in your life, your choices are not going to be good. Your choices probably tend to be bad ones, especially under duress. So freedom is important, but freedom, if you're not choosing love, then Augustine's view is that you're not really free. If you're choosing to harm people, then you're not really free. You're bound by these anti-love forces, these sinful forces, the sin reality, whether you call it the demonic, whether you call it sin itself, whether you simply say it's bad choices. The thing is, we are only free, truly free, when we choose love, We are only truly free when grace, empowers us to embrace others despite their limitations and their flaws. And we are only truly free when we are open to others to forgive them, and even as we challenge them to truthfulness and we challenge them to right, to justice, that we are open always to forgiveness rather than being caught in the addiction of hate, revenge, the cycles that are so much prevalent in our world. We are living in a world that's bound, that's enslaved to these forces. So I really tend to be with Augustine again. Partly it's my own experience, but partly it's the way I see the world. I mean, people are not just freely choosing to do bad things. I think they are caught by the demonic, by forces within them, and they need freedom, just like we need freedom from that kind of tyranny, from those who oppress us, right? We all need freedom. The question is what freedom we need. And only through the power of the Holy Spirit and the movement of God, the experience of grace in our hearts, that love gift filling us up, without that, we can never truly be free. That's what our world needs. That's what we need to proclaim with our deeds, our actions, our kindness, our care, our service, and our protest, that love is alone ultimately the answer. Thank you.